So, again, thank you very much for having me here. I'm very honored to be invited to talk to this group, which I've been following since the start, so I'm really happy to see it evolve through the years. So the title of my talk today is Transnational Governance and Community Building, the Case of Competition. And basically what I did when Jan Peter asked me to do this keynote, I took the title and subtitle of this year's conference, Knowing Governance, the Making of Governance Knowledge and the Transformation of Politics. I looked at the call in itself, and I kind of reformulated, in a sense, the questions that I myself address, or in a sense, the elements of the calls that I think I can try to address with my own work. So the way in which what I think I'm focusing more particularly with respect to the broader call for paper are the question, for example, of how is governance knowledge made, produced, and contested, and my own understanding of governance knowledge, which I give here, is the knowledge associated with governance, the knowledge that builds, sustains, legitimates governance, but also the knowledge that emerges through governance process. So that's what I'll start from in terms of what I mean here. The other types of issues that I'm particularly interested in the more recent work that I've been doing, particularly on transnational communities, is how do claims of authority and legitimacy associated with those emergent bodies of knowledge become established, become sustained, including in the face, obviously, of a lot of contestation and resistance. And finally, to a lesser extent, maybe how does this emergent governance knowledge translate into, articulate with concrete governance tools and mechanisms. But again, this is not so much, I won't be talking so much to that particular issue in the presentation, but more to the first two ones. So my talk today, and my objective really today, is to try to explore some of those issues as I reformulated them, to the mobilization of the concept of communities, which is an old sociological concept, but the mobilization of that concept into a transnational context. So, I'll get to what that means and what that implies in a minute. Building for the empirical part of my discussion upon work I've been doing for many, many years now, focusing on competition regulation and following actually competition regulation through history ever since the post-war World War II period to today. And I'll tell you a bit of that story and try to show you how I can connect that to those different issues. So the structure of my talk will be the following. First, I will actually, remind ourselves of some of the things that we know about transnational governance, and for that, I'll build obviously on my own work, but also on the work of a lot of other people, some of whom are in the room, and I'll, still make it as stylistic as possible, as simple as possible. From there, I will move on to the concept of transnational communities that we proposed in this more recent book with Sigrid Quack, and I will, explain a bit what we mean by that and how we define it and how we use it. Then I'll turn to the case of competition regulation, and focus on some of its key dimensions. And finally, I will try to bring this all back together, looking at transnational communities and governance knowledge and how do they play out in and around competition regulation. So this is the two books that I'm building from quite significantly in my discussions, at least of the first two parts of my talk here. So what do we know about transnational governance? Well, we know actually quite a number of things by now. First, we know that fields of transnational governance are issue-based and issue-specific, and that they cross over many traditional boundaries, particularly the national-transnational boundaries, particularly the private-public boundaries. We also know that fields of transnational governance are very much multi-centered topographies, that the governance process, the transnational governance process, has multiple nodes. and that those multiple nodes are connected in different ways through logics of competition. So sometimes we see outright competition, in other cases we see collaboration, in other cases we see merging, in fact, of the different nodes. So that's one thing that we know. Another thing we know is that those fields of transnational governance are fluid, in constant evolution, with a multiplication of actors and interests, more or less all the time. That they're very much open systems, and very often they are built as open systems, where we can see things like incremental negotiation, learning, participatory mechanisms of different kinds, one example of which being experimental governance in the EU, but also elsewhere. And something else we know about transnational governance is that actually states don't go, states remain. They remain involved in transnational governance processes, but they actually are there in different forms, and they are not there anymore as single main unitary actors building governing mechanisms. They are there as actors amongst others that have to take into account this very changed landscape. Something else we know also about transnational governance is that it's also characterized by a blurring of boundaries between regulators and regulatees. So to a greatest extent, transnational governance is partly self-governance or self-regulation. We know, and that's one of the major issues actually probably still today with respect to transnational governance, that we don't have an ultimate seat of legitimacy and power, which means a number of things. First, it means that the types of rules that emerge are quite different. And in a recent paper, I kind of use this image that we've moved from the rule of law to the law of rules, in a sense of what we're producing are standards, norms, guidelines, soft laws of different kinds. And that as a consequence of this also, rules tend to be voluntary. Soft law lacks the possibility of legal sanctions, and they are not legally binding. And the consequence also of the fact that we don't have ultimate seat of legitimacy and power is that actually what we see is very much a self-sustaining circle, self-sustaining dynamics where more rules breed more rules. Something that we proposed in the transnational governance volume is that in spite of this first picture that seems to be a quite messy picture, very, multi-centered, a lot of nodes, a lot of dynamics, a lot of things happening, there is something that we can identify as a very broad, very common culture, quote unquote, of transnational governance. And we identified essentially 5 main dimensions of that culture of transnational governance. One was the strong logic of marketization, so that we have really a market for ideas and rules out there. A second one was the strong role and presence of deliberative democracy in all those cases, empirical cases of transnational governance that we looked at. A third one was the ultimate, in a sense even, role and power of science and expertise in those fields of transnational governance. And science and expertise actually being used to overcome differences, but also to some extent to displace politics or to neutralize politics. But I think we can come back to that discussion. We also saw a very intense organizing process going on and intensifying through time. And finally, we saw socialized forms of control that took different forms, took the form of peer pressure, acculturation, persuasion, information transparency constraints, auditing, and the naming and shaming types of mechanisms that include accreditation, labelization, rankings, etc. All those forms of control appear much more significant within fields of transnational governance than incentives or straight forms of coercion. And as we were looking at what we kind of characterize as an emergent culture of transnational governance, we actually bumped into, to some extent, the role of something that we started to call transnational communities. So transnational communities, this is how we define them in the recent volume. Transnational communities are social groups emerging from mutual interactions across national boundaries, oriented around a common project which is constructed and sustained through the active involvement and engagement of at least some of their members. These social groups develop, nurture, and sustain in the process a shared imagined identity, to use the words of Benedict Anderson. And to transform the words of Benedict Anderson, rather. So transnational communities at first level, we might think that this is a bit of an oxymoron, in the sense that at first sight, our understanding of the notion of community, at least in sociology, is strongly shaped by Ferdinand Tönnies' classical dichotomy between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, and that the types of traditional notions of community that we work from very much still in sociology suggest things like bounded territory, physical proximity, direct and regular interactions, similarity and homogeneity, ascriptive and natural bonds, permanence and stability, all things that obviously seem to be quite far from what happens in transnational governance fields.